Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. We're going on another deep dive today, and this time we're exploring the fascinating and a bit puzzling relationship between Imam al-Ghazali, a true giant in Islamic thought,
Yeah.
and the Asharite school of theology.
Yes, a giant indeed.
Was he a devoted follower? A subtle critic, maybe even both. We'll be using Richard M. Frank's book, Al-Ghazali and the Asharite School, to guide our exploration and try to figure this out.
What I find so captivating about al-Ghazali is that his expertise extended far beyond just theology. He delved into law, philosophy, ethics, and even mysticism, all with remarkable depth and clarity. Today's deep dive focuses on one specific thread of his vast intellectual tapestry, his interaction with what we call kalam, Islamic scholastic theology. It's fascinating to consider this vibrant intellectual tradition where scholars use logic and reason to explore the intricacies of Islamic beliefs.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar with kalam, imagine using the tools of philosophy to explore and defend the core principles of Islam.
Exactly, and it's important to understand the context in which kalam emerged. Think about the Abbasid era, a golden age of Islamic civilization. During this time, translations of Greek philosophical works were widely circulating, leading to intense debates about the relationship between reason and revelation.
Yeah.
Kalam arose as a way to engage with these new intellectual currents and defend Islamic beliefs in a language that resonated with the philosophical discourse of the time.
And the Asharite school.
Yes, the Asharite school, they were one of the most prominent and influential schools within Kalam.
Right.
They were known for their sophisticated use of logic and their nuanced theological positions.
So to truly grasp al-Ghazali's place in the broader landscape of Islamic thought, it's crucial to understand how he interacted with this school.
Precisely. And there's another layer to this story. Al-Ghazali's own personal journey.
Oh, right.
A man of immense intellect who achieved great recognition as a teacher at the prestigious Nizamiya College of Baghdad. But then, he experienced a profound spiritual crisis, which he details in his autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, which translates to deliverance from error. This crisis led him away from traditional scholarship towards a more introspective, inward-focused path.
So how did this personal shift impact his relationship with the more formal, structured theological system of the Asharites?
That is the very question we'll be exploring. As we dive deeper into al-Ghazali's writings, we'll uncover this intricate dance between tradition and innovation, between moments of alignment with the Asharites and moments of subtle but significant critique.
It's fascinating.
He was much more than a mere Asharite theologian. He was al-Ghazali, a brilliant mind carving his own unique path within the rich tapestry of Islamic thought.
To start, let's lay some groundwork.
Hmm.
The Asharite school held a specific view on kalam. How did they perceive its purpose and role within the larger framework of Islamic thought?
Like many scholars of their time, the Asharites saw kalam as a vital tool, for defending the faith against a whole array of theological challenges. Remember, this was an era of intense intellectual and theological debate, and various groups were questioning or reinterpreting core Islamic beliefs.
Right.
The Asharites firmly believed that kalam, with its emphasis on logic and rational argumentation, provided the necessary intellectual weapons to counter these challenges and safeguard Islamic doctrine.
So it's like kalam was the intellectual armor of the faith.
Exactly, a way to fortify the intellectual foundations of Islam. But, and this is important, they were also mindful of the potential pitfalls of kalam.
Right.
There was always this concern that excessive reliance on speculative reasoning could lead one astray from the revealed truths of the Quran and the Sunnah.
I see. So it's a delicate balance. Using reason to defend the faith, but always being cautious not to let reason overshadow or contradict revelation. Did al-Ghazali share this view on the purpose and boundaries of kalam?
Al-Ghazali, now he had a very nuanced perspective on kalam.
Okay.
Unlike some mystical thinkers who might have rejected it outright, he recognized its validity and importance as a religious science. But, and this is crucial, he divided kalam into distinct categories based on its subject matter and purpose. This classification really highlights his careful and thoughtful approach to balancing reason and revelation.
So categories of kalam, that's interesting. Can you elaborate on this classification system? What were these different types of kalam and what was the rationale behind this distinction?
He argued that the kind of kalam typically taught in schools, what we might think of as introductory kalam, was not intended to delve into the ultimate nature of reality. Its primary function was to defend the faith against objections and heresies, to provide a rational basis for belief and to clarify those core tenets of Islam. It was about establishing a solid foundation, so to speak.
So Kalam 101, getting the basics down and addressing some common misconceptions.
Precisely. But then he goes on to point to another, more advanced level of kalam, one that transcends basic apologetics and goes deeper, grappling with those big philosophical and metaphysical questions about God, creation, and the very nature of reality. It's kalam for the advanced student, the one ready to engage with the truly profound mysteries.
I see. So al-Ghazali is suggesting that Kalam operates on different levels, each serving a distinct purpose. But did he ultimately see Kalam, even in its most advanced form, as a path to true knowledge of God?
That's where his views become even more intriguing.
Okay.
While he acknowledged the value of kalam for defending and clarifying Islamic beliefs, he was also very clear about its limitations.
In what way?
He believed that kalam, even in its most sophisticated form, could not fully grasp the essence of God or the true nature of reality.
Why not? What was it about Kalam that he felt fell short in this ultimate quest for knowledge?
Al-Ghazali believed that the true essential nature of things, what he called the haqa'iq, or realities, are not revealed through human reason alone. They are only accessible through divine revelation, as found in the Quran and the authentic sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Sunnah.
So even the most advanced Kalam, while valuable for defending the faith and clarifying concepts, can't fully grasp the deepest truths about God and creation.
That's exactly his point. He's not dismissing kalam, but he's placing it within a hierarchy of knowledge, if you will. Kalam is a valuable tool, but it's not the ultimate key to unlocking the mysteries of existence.
It's interesting because this reminds me of al-Ghazali's emphasis on spiritual experience. He wasn't content with simply constructing logical arguments about God. He sought to experience God directly.
Yeah.
So his views on the limitations of Kalam probably stem from his own spiritual insights, from a place of knowing that there are truths that lie beyond the reach of human reason.
Yes, absolutely. Al-Ghazali's personal journey of spiritual transformation deeply informed his intellectual outlook. He wasn't satisfied with mere intellectual constructs about God. He yearned for a direct personal connection and experience of the divine. And this experiential dimension is key to understanding his nuanced perspective on kalam.
It makes me reflect on his famous spiritual crisis, the period of intense doubt and introspection that led him to question the value of traditional scholarship, including Kalam. Did this experience lead him to abandon Kalam altogether, or did he find a way to integrate it into his new, transformed worldview?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of al-Ghazali's brilliance. He didn't completely abandon kalam, but he definitely reevaluated its place and significance in light of his experience.
Okay.
His spiritual crisis led him to a deeper understanding of the limitations of human reason, and this profoundly shaped his approach to kalam.
Right. This circles back to his idea that the true, essential natures of things are only truly revealed through divine revelation. Do you have a concrete example of how he applied this principle in his writings? Where do we see this tension between reason and revelation playing out in a specific way?
One striking example is his discussion of secondary causation.
Right.
It was a hot topic in Islamic theology at the time, and it deals with how we understand God's relationship to the world. The Ash'arites, with their strong emphasis on God's absolute power, tended to downplay the role of secondary causes, arguing that God could create the world directly without any intermediaries.
So like saying that God doesn't need to rely on any natural laws or processes, he can simply will things into existence directly.
Exactly. This view is known as occasionalism, and it's a powerful affirmation of God's omnipotence. Now, al-Ghazali, while agreeing that God is the ultimate cause of everything, took a more nuanced approach to those secondary causes.
Okay, so tell me more about al-Ghazali's view. How did he reconcile the concept of secondary causes with the idea of God's absolute power?
He argued that while God certainly possesses the power to create everything directly, he has, in his wisdom, chosen to establish a certain order and regularity within the universe.
Right.
This order, which we might call the laws of nature, allows secondary causes to operate in a predictable, seemingly independent manner.
So it's not that secondary causes possess any independent power, it's that God has ordained them to operate in this specific way.
Precisely. He uses the analogy of fire and burning.
Oh.
We observe that fire burns cotton, but al-Ghazali reminds us that it's ultimately God who grants fire that power to burn. Fire itself is merely an instrument in God's hands.
It's a vivid image, like God is the master puppeteer, and the natural laws and processes are the strings he uses to orchestrate the grand play of creation. but the puppet master is always in control.
A wonderful way to put it. And this perspective allows al-Ghazali to affirm both God's absolute sovereignty and the apparent efficacy of secondary causes. It's a delicate balancing act, highlighting his sophisticated approach to reconciling reason and revelation.
This leads me to another question, though. If al-Ghazali placed such a strong emphasis on divine revelation, what did he think about the role of logic and reason in understanding Islamic beliefs?
Despite his reservations about the limits of reason, al-Ghazali was, in fact, a master of logic himself.
Right.
He recognized the legitimate role of reason in Islamic thought, but was careful to delineate its boundaries.
So how did he view the appropriate role of reason in relation to revelation?
He believed that when properly guided by revelation, reason could be a valuable tool for clarifying, systematizing Islamic beliefs, defending the faith against objections, and even gaining certain kinds of knowledge about the natural world.
Okay.
However, he was adamant that reason should never be used to contradict or undermine the clear teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah.
So reason is a powerful tool, but it must be used in service of revelation, not in opposition to it.
Precisely. And this is a fundamental principle in al-Ghazali's thought: intellectual humility.
Right.
He recognized the power of human reason, but also understood its inherent limitations. He constantly reminded us that we are finite beings attempting to comprehend an infinite God, a task we should approach with humility and awe.
This connects back to the title of his autobiography, Deliverance from Error. It seems his entire intellectual project was driven by a deep desire to avoid error, to protect Islamic thought from veering into false or misleading conclusions.
That's a very insightful observation. This concern with avoiding error is one of the things that makes al-Ghazali such a compelling figure. He wasn't just interested in building elaborate theological systems for the sake of it. He was deeply concerned with the real-world implications of belief, with how our ideas about God shape our lives and actions.
This brings us back to that complex relationship with the Asharite school.
Yes.
We know he had certain criticisms of their approach to Kalam, yet he often presented his own views in a way that, at least on the surface, seemed to be in harmony with their doctrines.
Right.
How do we reconcile this seeming contradiction?
That's the real puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a question that has kept scholars busy for centuries. It's like trying to solve a fascinating but intricate jigsaw puzzle where some of the pieces might be missing. Was he deliberately attempting to reform the Asharite school from within? Was he employing a sophisticated rhetorical strategy to make his own views more palatable to the broader intellectual community? Or was it something else entirely? To unravel this mystery, we need to carefully examine his specific writings and analyze how he engages with key Asharite doctrines.
Well, I'm definitely ready to dive in and see what insights we can uncover.
I think you'll find it fascinating. Al-Ghazali was a master at weaving together diverse intellectual strands, and his engagement with the Asharite school really showcases his ability to navigate this complex theological landscape while carving out his own unique path.
This is going to be quite a journey. I can't wait to explore these ideas further and see what we discover together.
So let's shift our focus now to two of al-Ghazali's tracts, al-Itisard fil I'tiqad,
Okay.
which translates to The Moderation in Belief, and al-Qudsiyya. These texts are particularly interesting because they're considered to be pretty Asharite in their content.
Okay.
They give us a window into how al-Ghazali was engaging with core Asharite doctrines during a certain period in his intellectual development.
So we're going to put on our textual detective hats now, examine these tracts, and see if we can find clues about al-Ghazali's relationship with the Asharite school.
Right.
It's like we're time travelers peeking over his shoulder as he grapples with these big theological questions.
I like that.
What kinds of topics did he address in these works?
He covers a whole range of topics that are central to Islamic theology.
Yeah.
You know, moral obligation, the creation of the universe, human agency, God's attributes, even the nature of angels and jinn.
Interesting.
You can just imagine the lively debates that must have been happening in those scholarly circles.
Right.
These tracts give us a peek right into the heart of those discussions.
Let's start with moral obligation. This is something that has intrigued philosophers and theologians for centuries.
Right.
What makes an action right or wrong? Is it something inherent in the action itself, or is it determined by some external factor? How did al-Ghazali approach this question in these tracts?
Well, in al-Itisard, al-Ghazali aligns himself with a key Asharite principle. that moral obligation comes from divine command.
Okay.
In other words, an action becomes morally obligatory because God has commanded it, and an action is wrong because God has forbidden it.
Mm-hmm.
So good and evil aren't inherent qualities of actions themselves, but are determined by God's will.
So he's saying that there isn't some kind of objective, universal moral law that exists independently of God.
Right.
Morality, in al-Ghazali's view, is ultimately grounded in divine revelation, as found in the Quran and the Sunnah.
Exactly. This stance distinguishes the Asharite school from other schools of thought that held more objective or rationalistic views of morality. For al-Ghazali and the Asharites, the ultimate source of moral knowledge comes from the Quran and the Sunnah, not from human reason or intuition.
This raises an interesting question, though.
Okay.
If morality depends entirely on God's will, wouldn't that mean that God could, hypothetically, command something that we normally consider evil, and it would then become good?
Well, that's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries.
Right.
The Asharites, including al-Ghazali, would argue that God's will is always in harmony with his wisdom and justice.
Okay.
So even if we don't fully understand the reasons behind God's commands, we can trust that they're ultimately for our benefit and the benefit of all creation.
So it requires a certain amount of trust in God's wisdom and a recognition that we, with our limited human understanding, can't fully grasp the divine plan.
Yes, it underscores the absolute sovereignty of God in defining right and wrong.
Right.
It emphasizes that God isn't bound by any external moral standards. He's the ultimate judge of what is good and what is evil, and it is our moral duty to submit to his will as revealed through his commands.
Okay, so let's move on to another major topic al-Ghazali tackles in these tracks: the creation of the universe.
Right.
This is where we get into those fascinating discussions about secondary causation, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
Does al-Ghazali just follow the standard Asharite line on this? Or does he bring in some of his own nuances?
Well, this is where we start to see al-Ghazali kind of gently pushing the boundaries of that traditional Asharite thought. Remember the Asharites?
Yeah.
With their emphasis on God's direct action, they often downplayed the role of secondary causes.
Right.
Al-Ghazali doesn't completely reject this idea, though. He still affirms that God has absolute power and that everything depends on his will. But he adds a layer of nuance by suggesting that God has established a certain lawfulness within creation, like a system of secondary causes that operate in a predictable way, according to patterns that God has ordained.
So, like, God has set the universe in motion, established the rules of the game, so to speak, but he's still the one ultimately running the show.
Yes, exactly. It's subtle, but it's a significant shift from that stricter occasionalism you see in some Asharite thinkers. Al-Ghazali seems to be hinting that God doesn't need to constantly intervene in every single event you see.
Right.
He's established a system of secondary causation that allows the universe to unfold according to his plan.
This makes me think of things like the laws of physics and chemistry, those sorts of natural laws that govern the physical world.
Yes.
It's like al-Ghazali saying that these laws reflect God's will and wisdom, that they operate according to a divine blueprint.
Exactly. He's saying that studying these laws, understanding how they work, it's a way of gaining knowledge about God's creation, appreciating the intricacies of his design. It's it's like examining the intricate mechanisms of a beautifully crafted clock, right?
Yeah.
And marveling at the skill of the clockmaker, but always remembering that the clockmaker is the one who designed it, the one who set the clock in motion in the first place.
Now, this brings us to another fascinating area al-Ghazali explores in these tracks: human agency.
Right.
The question of free will versus determinism.
Yeah.
It's a classic philosophical puzzle, right?
A big one.
And it takes on an even greater weight when considered within a theological framework that stresses God's absolute power and knowledge.
Exactly.
So how did al-Ghazali approach this tricky issue?
This is one of those really complex and debated aspects of al-Ghazali's thought.
Okay.
In Al-Qudsiyya, he asserts that humans do have a certain degree of free will, the capacity to choose their actions.
Okay.
But he's careful to place that freedom within the context of God's overall will and knowledge.
So how does that work? How does he reconcile human freedom with the idea that God already knows everything that's going to happen?
Yeah.
If God knows what we're going to choose, our choice is really free.
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
And true to form, al-Ghazali doesn't give a simple, straightforward answer.
Right.
He acknowledges how difficult this problem is and offers a few possible solutions. But he leaves some room for ambiguity. It's
Cool.
like he's suggesting that God's knowledge of our future actions doesn't negate our free will, but rather encompasses it.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Right.
It's more of a both hand.
Yeah.
God knows what we'll choose, but we still make those choices freely.
Yeah. That seems to be the direction he's heading in, but of course it's open to interpretation.
Right.
He uses an analogy of a person looking down from a tall tower.
What?
This person can see everything happening below, people walking, birds flying, clouds moving.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean they're causing those things to happen, right?
Right.
They're just observing from a vantage point that allows them to see the bigger picture.
So God's knowledge is kind of like that.
Right.
He sees the whole tapestry of time, including our choices, but he's not forcing our hand or dictating our every move.
Exactly. It's a way of affirming both God's omniscience and human freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Al-Ghazali doesn't definitively solve the puzzle. Maybe it's a mystery that human reason can't fully grasp.
Right.
But he gives us a way to think about it that preserves both divine sovereignty and human moral responsibility.
It seems like even when he's working within those traditional Asharite doctrines, al-Ghazali is always pushing us to think deeper, to wrestle with these complex questions.
Right.
He doesn't offer easy answers, but he invites us on this intellectual and spiritual journey.
Yes, that's what makes him such an engaging and enduring thinker. He tackles the tough questions head on.
Right.
He doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Right.
More like a guide, a fellow traveler helping us navigate those intricate paths of knowledge and faith.
Okay, so let's dive back into these texts.
All right.
What other topics does al-Ghazali explore in these tracts that might shed light on his relationship with the Asharite school?
We've been focusing on al-Ghazali's exploration of Asharite doctrines in al-Ihsan and al-Qudsiya, particularly his take on moral obligation, creation, and human agency.
Right.
But those are just a few threads in the rich tapestry of these works.
Okay.
He also delves into God's essential attributes,
Mm-hmm.
the nature of created beings, the connection between the soul and the body, and even the rational evidence for prophecy.
It sounds like he's covering a lot of ground here, those big questions that lie at the heart of Islamic theology.
Yes.
Did he always stick strictly to the Asharite position on these issues? Or did he offer his own interpretations, maybe even critiques?
That's where the real intellectual detective work comes in.
Okay.
While these tracts are generally considered Asharite in their framework,
Mm-hmm.
if you look closely, you'll find subtle but significant departures that hint at al-Ghazali's independent thinking.
Interesting.
He wasn't just repeating what the Asharites said. He was engaging with their ideas critically, refining them, and sometimes subtly challenging those core assumptions.
It's like he's having this conversation with the Asharite tradition, honoring its legacy, but also pushing it in new directions.
Yes, exactly.
Do you have a specific example of where we see that subtle critique happening?
One example that stands out is his discussion of God's attributes.
Okay.
The Asharites, in their efforts to uphold God's absolute unity and transcendence, we're really careful to avoid language that might suggest anthropomorphism,
Right.
attributing human qualities to God in a literal sense.
Mm-hmm.
They developed a whole system for talking about God's attributes in a way that preserved his uniqueness and incomparability.
So, like, affirming that God possesses attributes like knowledge, power, will,
Yes.
but also emphasizing that those attributes are fundamentally different from anything we can understand as humans.
Precisely. It's like trying to describe the sun's brilliance while acknowledging that our eyes can't fully grasp its intensity. Al-Ghazali, following the Asharite tradition, affirms those attributes, but emphasizes their absolute otherness, their radical difference from any human qualities.
You said he introduced his own nuances.
Yes.
Where do we see him departing from the standard Asharite position?
One subtle but important difference is his emphasis on the limitations of human language and reason to grasp God's attributes.
Okay.
The Asharites developed intricate systems to explain these attributes, but al-Ghazali seems to suggest that they're ultimately beyond our comprehension.
I see. He stresses the apophatic approach,
Mm-hmm.
a way of knowing God by focusing on what he is not rather than what he is.
So it's a kind of negative theology, recognizing that human concepts are inadequate to capture the divine essence.
Exactly. It's a stance of intellectual humility,
Right.
acknowledging that vast gulf between the creator and the created. This focus on the apophatic approach reflects al-Ghazali's mystical inclinations.
Okay.
His understanding that true knowledge of God doesn't come from abstract reasoning, but from direct spiritual experience,
Yeah.
a humbling encounter with the divine mystery.
This makes me think of his analogy of the ocean and the drop of water.
Yes.
He uses that to show the limitations of human reason in comprehending God's infinity.
Right.
The drop, representing human understanding, can never fully contain or grasp the vastness of the ocean, which represents God's knowledge.
It's a beautiful illustration. He reminds us that we're dealing with realities that go far beyond our finite minds.
And this awareness, this intellectual and spiritual humility, is crucial when we're talking about the divine. It's a theme that runs through all his works, even the ones that seem Asherite on the surface.
So we're seeing how al-Ghazali, even when he's working within that Asherite system, is always pushing us towards a deeper, more experiential understanding of God.
Right.
He's not just interested in mastering theological concepts.
No.
He wants to guide us towards a direct encounter with that divine reality.
Exactly. And that emphasis on spiritual experience, on the limits of human reason, sets him apart from some of the more strictly rationalistic Asherite thinkers.
Okay.
He's weaving his own mystical insights into that traditional framework, giving it this depth and vibrancy that speaks to that human longing for connection with the divine.
But this raises a question that we've been circling around.
Yeah.
If al-Ghazali had these subtle critiques of the Asherite school, why did he often present his views in a way that seemed to align with theirs? Was he trying to subtly undermine them while still appearing to be a follower?
That is the million-dollar question. And it continues to be debated among scholars. It's like trying to decipher a secret code, searching for hidden meanings between the lines.
Yeah.
There are a few possible interpretations, each with its own pros and cons.
Okay. What are some of those leading theories?
One theory is that, at least in his earlier works, al-Ghazali was genuinely trying to bridge the gap between his own views and those of the Asherite school.
Okay.
He may have seen value in their system, but also recognized its limitations. So perhaps he was aiming for reform from within, subtly steering them towards a direction that resonated more with his own theological and spiritual understanding.
So kind of constructive criticism, working within the system to try to improve it.
Exactly. But then, as his thinking matured, particularly after his spiritual transformation, his criticisms might have become more pronounced, leading to the clearer breaks we see in his later works.
It's like he gradually outgrew the confines of that Asherite framework and moved towards a more expansive, experiential understanding of Islam.
Exactly.
His early works, like the ones we discussed, show this deep engagement with Asherite doctrines. But then his later writings, particularly after his spiritual crisis, reflect a more independent, critical stance.
Yes, the chronological order of his writings is a really important clue.
Right.
His early works seem like a sincere effort to harmonize, while his later works show a growing willingness to challenge those core assumptions.
And that leads us to another interpretation, that al-Ghazali was using a deliberate rhetorical strategy.
Right.
He might have been intentionally using that Asherite language, even when he didn't agree, to make his own views more palatable to a wider audience.
That's an interesting possibility. He was writing in a time and place where openly challenging established schools could be risky.
Right.
And he was a brilliant communicator, highly skilled in persuasion. Perhaps he was using a kind of coded language, weaving his insights into the familiar fabric of Asherite thought,
Right.
to avoid drawing too much attention.
So he's speaking a language that resonates with those familiar with Asherite ideas, but also conveying subtle messages to those who can read between the lines.
Exactly. It's a sophisticated possibility.
Right.
It suggests a level of intellectual and strategic brilliance that would be consistent with his reputation.
It's like he's playing a multi-dimensional chess game, carefully positioning his pieces within that existing structure while also laying the groundwork for a whole new game.
That's a great analogy. It captures that complexity and the subtlety of al-Ghazali's relationship with the Asherites.
Yeah.
He's both a master of the traditional game and a visionary pointing toward new horizons.
Okay, so we have these two main interpretations.
Yeah.
Al-Ghazali, the reformer, trying to change things from within, and al-Ghazali, the strategist, using rhetoric to veil his criticisms.
Right.
Are there any other clues that might help us figure out which is more likely?
Well, there's another piece to consider, and this is where it gets even more fascinating.
Okay.
Al-Ghazali's focus on the spiritual dimension of knowledge. As we've discussed, he constantly stressed the limitations of human reason and the importance of direct spiritual experience. This suggests his engagement with the Asherites might have been part of a larger goal to combine the rigor of Kalam with the depth of mysticism.
Okay.
He may have seen the Asherite system as a valuable tool for clarifying and defending Islamic beliefs, but ultimately insufficient for achieving true knowledge of God.
So he's using kalam as a jumping-off point, leading to a journey that goes beyond rational discourse and into spiritual enlightenment.
That's a beautiful way to put it. He acknowledges the value of kalam, but points toward a deeper, more profound way of knowing.
Right.
He's inviting us on this journey of transformation, both intellectually and spiritually. A journey that leads not only to a deeper understanding of those Islamic doctrines, but to a closely more experiential connection with the divine.
This has been an amazing journey through the world of Islamic thought,
It has.
exploring al-Ghazali's complex relationship with the Asharite school, his views on kalam, his emphasis on the spiritual side of knowledge.
Yes.
As we wrap up, what's the main takeaway, the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
If there's one key takeaway, it's this. Al-Ghazali, in his complex, sometimes paradoxical relationship with the Asharites, demonstrates that genuine intellectual and spiritual growth requires this interplay between tradition and innovation, between reason and revelation, intellectual rigor and spiritual humility. He challenges us to engage with our own intellectual traditions, to be critical, but also courageous. To seek knowledge from various sources and never stop pursuing that deeper, more experiential connection with the divine.
It's a timeless message that the pursuit of knowledge isn't just an academic exercise, it's a transformative journey
Right.
that can lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves, the world, our place in it all.
Beautifully said.
For those wanting to explore further, I encourage you to read al-Ghazali's works for yourself.
Yes, that
You might be surprised at how much his insights still resonate today, how much he has to teach us about those big questions that have always fascinated humanity. God, the universe, the meaning of life.
absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope it sparked your curiosity, inspired you to explore these timeless ideas further.
Yes.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.